Before we get started, please don't forget to rate and review wherever possible. It really helps our podcast find the ears of listeners just like you. Also, if you have a story to tell, don't forget to submit it via email at contact@campfirecultpod.com or leave a voicemail message at 720-297-8608. You can also follow us anywhere socially at Campfire Cult Pod and visit us online at campfirecultpod.com. Welcome, dear listener, to the Campfire Cult Podcast. From a camper van deep in the haunted woods, I bring you first-hand accounts of chilling encounters with the paranormal. Step into the night and take a peek into the realm where reality and the supernatural collide. My name is Jazz, and I'll be your host. Welcome back, campers. Tonight I'm taking you camping again, where we'll step into the shadows where white crawlers, stalkers, meth heads, and dark entities lurk. Let's jump right in. First up, alone camping in northeastern Ohio, a man has a late night run-in with two tweakers deep in the wilderness.
Not too long ago, I was camping in northeast Ohio by myself. On the third and final night there, I woke up to pee and walked about 10 feet from my hammock. It was then that I noticed a headlamp about 80 to 100 feet from me. I watched it for about 10 minutes. I got my boots on and grabbed my hatchet, starting to walk to the right of my campsite. I was going to find out what he was up to. I got about 50 yards from my site and started walking towards him when I noticed another headlamp about 40 feet from me walking around. I hit the ground and threw some leaves on myself as he walked about 10 feet from where I was laying. Then he stopped, lit a cigarette, and finished his beer. After he got far enough that he couldn't hear me, I got up and started walking towards the first guy. I got close enough to him that I could hear his phone receiving messages. I moved up closer to him quietly to where I could see his face lit up from his cell phone. That's when he stood up and started walking towards my hammock. I laid there on the ground for a minute and made my way towards my site. I stopped when I started hearing my tarp that I had above my hammock being trashed. Then I could see flashlights, and then my big flashlight at camp turn on and off. I heard my mess kit being tossed around and them talking about how I was just there and wondering where I had gone. I laid on the ground and watched my flashlight walk away until it was a small, dim light. I hid all night, but when the sun came up and I returned, my whole site was destroyed. My hammock and tarp were shredded by what looked like a machete. My mess kit was stomped on. They took my backpack, rain gear, and flashlight. I went to the spot where I saw the first guy and found chew tobacco pouches, 8 empty beer cans, and an empty lighter. I walked to where I saw the other guy and found an empty bag of powder, which turned out to be meth, a mess of cigarette butts, and a pile of shit with no toilet paper to be found. I've heard of these types of things happening with more frequency all over the country, especially places out west where tweakers seem to thrive. I really wish people would have more respect for our wild places and each other. I have no idea what they would have done to me if I had still been in my camp. That was the luckiest pee I've ever taken.
Next, a quick weekend camping trip takes a scary turn with an unseen threat lurking in the darkness.
My partner and I made the decision to head to our usual camping spot, a low-key area rarely visited by others, with only 1 or 2 people at a time. We're usually miles away from other campsites around the mountain. This spot isn't well known, and as is our tradition every year, we brought along my parents' little elderly dog. Prior to our arrival, we scoped out the area to gauge its busyness. To our surprise, there was absolutely nobody in sight, and the entire mountain seemed empty and all ours to enjoy. Typically, we'd encounter at least one hunter or fisherman in the vicinity, but not this time. We relaxed by the fire with my little dog nearby, soaking in the peace and solitude. When it was time to turn in for the night, my usually calm pup refused to settle down inside the tent. Because of the warm weather, we had the tent unzipped with just the mesh covering so we could feel the breeze. However, my pup was fixated on something just outside the tent. We decided to investigate and found nothing unusual, so we returned to the fire. Suddenly, my dog became agitated, hackles raised, growling deeply in the direction of the woods. Concerned, we armed ourselves with a hunting knife and axe and listened intently for any kind of disturbance. The dog continued snarling and barking, behavior unlike any other year we've taken her. After hours of pup unease, we lit up our campsite with the truck lights, trying to discern the cause of my dog's distress. We didn't find anything. Despite our efforts, my dog remained on edge. Then, all of a sudden, we heard a loud tree branch snap just 10 feet away in the pitch black of the wilderness. Fearing for our safety, we retreated to the safety of the truck, hearts pounding, waiting to see if the threat would pass. 30 tense minutes later, we cautiously returned to our campsite. My dog's hackles were still raised, and we heard the haunting howls of wolves in the distance. With mounting concern and considering the prevalence of cougars in the area, known for attacking unsuspecting campers and hikers, we decided it was better to be safe than sorry. Completely unarmed and no match for a mountain lion or a pack of wolves, we chose to leave. After all this time, we still don't know what it was in the woods that was just outside of our firelight. Could have been a mountain lion, wolf, coyote, or something more mysterious in nature. When we shared our experience with my partner's parents, we were made fun of and accused of being overly cautious, with too big of imaginations. I know there are real dangers in the wilderness, but this felt different than anything I have ever experienced in the wild. Again, better to be safe than sorry.
Up next, two backcountry campers face an unknown creature in the pitch black darkness of the Colorado wilderness.
I've been doing 3-day to week-long deep backcountry camping for about 15 years now, usually solo with my pup, but on occasion with my best friend. Most of these scary situations happened early on, within the first 2 to 3 years when my friend and I were young, foolish, and obviously invincible. On one occasion, in southern Colorado, we'd just summited a peak pretty late in the day, and by the time we were halfway down, it had gotten too dark to see too far in front of us. Our camp was set up much lower down the mountain, but we were scrambling over boulders and crags on a steep incline in pitch black dark, so we just said fuck it and decided to bush camp, like literally sleeping in a bush. There was this shrub on the side of the mountain that looked like it'd be decent enough to camp in. It formed roughly a semicircle with an opening in the middle where we could sleep in a way that felt walled off and protective. So we laid down close by each other for warmth and managed to doze off. Sometime in the middle of the night, my buddy woke me up asking if I heard that. I listened and could hear something walking around outside the bush. A weird guttural growling noise, not deep, just weird sounding. We stayed absolutely still and kept listening, hoping whatever goddamn mountain banshee it was would just move on. It didn't. It kept poking around the perimeter of the bush, and it sounded big. Eventually, it made its way over to where the semicircle opened up to the inside, and it was so pitch black out that we could just make out a mass, but had no idea what it was. We were completely frozen, just staring ahead. My buddy whispered, "What was that?" I slowly grabbed my phone, shone the light at it, and saw that it was a mountain lion. It looked huge, but for all we knew, it could have been a baby. It growled at the light and made a quick movement, like crouched down suddenly, and just kept staring and doing that weird growling thing. I have no idea what came over me. Fight or flight kicked in, and I guess the part of me that took over had realized there was nowhere to flight. So I slowly grabbed the machete next to me, unsheathed it, and somehow I jumped up and immediately started screaming. putting my hands up in the air and swinging the machete around wildly. Whatever I did worked, and it took off really quick, just darted off across the mountain into the night. Needless to say, we got up and made the middle of the night trek back to our camp, which took another several hours. About a year after that, my same friend and I had the fun idea to take a week-long kayak trip down the Arkansas River, only we didn't have a kayak, and both being college students at the time, couldn't really afford one, so naturally we bought a 2-person inflatable kayak for like $60 and figured we'd be good. And we mostly were. We punctured it on a submerged tree our second day on the river, but we patched it and continued on. On the third day, we suddenly realized we were going down the river right through hunting grounds at the height of hunting season. There were occasional gunshots going off all around us. At the time, it felt like it just added to the adventure. But the third night is where shit got really weird, and which I still don't really have an explanation for to this day. We kept waking up in the middle of the night to relight the fire outside our tent. It was deathly cold, and we also thought it might help signal to hunters that, hey, humans are out here, maybe don't shoot us. Around 4 a.m., when it was still pitch black but soon to be getting lighter, we were both outside feeding the fire. Something caught my eye to the left of us in the woods. Some kind of light, or something reflective. It seemed to move. A deer's eyes, I thought at first. I didn't really think much of it until I kept seeing it, and something just seemed off. I didn't say anything at first, and then, right as I was about to ask my friend if he saw it, he said, "Hey man, you see that thing over there?" And that's when we realized we'd both been watching this thing. The odd thing is that it was just one light source. It wasn't like 2 reflective eyes. It wasn't emitting a ray of light like a flashlight. It just seemed reflective the way an animal's eyes would reflect light and appear to light up. It was like that. But it was only one round object, and it was meandering slowly through the woods not too far off from where we were. It looked like an eye reflecting light and looking right at us. Confused and curious, I stood up, grabbed my small, weak flashlight, shined it over towards it, and started walking slowly towards it. "Hello?" I called out. Nothing. "Hey, anyone over there? We're just camping here and about to head off." No response, but every time I spoke, that object stopped moving. And then it would start moving again. I could hear crunching where it was moving across through the foliage. I couldn't make out a shape or body form. It just looked like something roughly the diameter of a flashlight looking over at us. Curious still, I kept walking closer to it. It stopped moving. The more I looked at it, the more it really did look like a flashlight, but like one where the bulb was so low and dim, it was almost dead. Either that or a really, really big singular fucking eyeball that seemed to be reflecting light from some unknown light source. We were both still and staring at each other, neither of us making a move. It felt like we stayed that way for about 5 minutes, but it was probably realistically a minute or less. Whatever it was, it had been moving closer. It started off probably about 100 feet behind us to the left, and it was now probably 30-40 feet. When it did move, it kind of bobbed up and down in an erratic fashion, similar, I think, to what it might look like if someone was holding a flashlight and walking through a forest over twigs and logs and rocks. I took another step forward, really straining my eyes to try and make out what that thing could be up ahead of me through the trees. As soon as I did, this thing, whatever it was, started moving straight towards me at a very high speed. Whereas before it was kind of slowly meandering and bumbling around, this time it seemed intentional and fast. I booked it in the opposite direction, grabbed my friend, ran over to where our little nylon inflatable kayak was tied to a tree by the river, cut the rope, and we paddled away as fast as we could. We didn't even look behind us. We were just frantically paddling. We left our tent and food and bags behind and just took off. When day broke later, we went back for our stuff and everything was right where we'd left it, untouched. Neither of us noticed any footprints. We both saw the same exact thing and had the same exact experience, and neither of us today has a satisfying explanation for what the fuck that was.
Next, an unsettling night in the woods turns terrifying when mysterious figures in white torment a group of Boy Scouts.
About 7 years ago, when I was around 19 or 20 years old and serving as a scout leader, a strange incident occurred during a camp in a forest approximately 10 to 15 minutes drive from the nearest city. Every year in July, we would have an international scout camp where scouts from different European countries would join together. I was in the preparations team, and we would go around 2 to 3 weeks in advance to clean and put the tents up. In the preparation team, we had around 20 people, all in our late teens or early 20s. If anyone has been a scout might know that the first thing in a camp is setting up a flag. The flag is an important part of this camping game. Other scouts would constantly try to steal the flag. If they managed to steal it, the team that lost the flag would have to go home. Side note, this never actually happened. No one was ever sent home. It was just a rule to keep other members involved and willing to protect the flag. We had to constantly keep an eye or a guard near the flag because of this perceived consequence. Other games involved attacking other teams and kidnapping members. All fun and games, nothing violent or harsh. It was fun and made us be alert, 24/7. So here is where my creepy story begins. The other 2 countries from Europe, of about 60 people, were set to arrive in the morning. We had nothing left to do before their arrival, so we set up a campfire and started singing and talking. Generally, just having a good time. We had our guards set up in different locations for the night. 2 near the flag, 2 near the entrance, and 2 in the woods facing the river. We would change guards every 2 hours. Each guard had a whistle, and if an animal or a person was to come to the camp, they would blow a certain note of a whistle to alarm everyone. That night, I was an hour into sleep when I heard a whistle. We all woke up and ran to the team member who had whistled. She claimed she saw 3 white figures running fast in the forest near the set-up tents with no flashlights. We thought that the teams arriving in the morning came early and were sneaking in to steal the flag or kidnap a team member, so we all decided to stay awake and go into defense mode. We each stood guard in different locations, watching for any signs of life. After some time, we started hearing whistles from the deeper parts of the forest. We also started hearing radio sounds from different places. We saw some figures in white again running around in the forest. Me and 2 other people decided to check the empty tents to see if there were people hiding in them, but couldn't find anyone. Then we started walking around and we heard loud laughter from a bush near us. It sounded like a woman laughing. So we started laughing too as we thought we found the other scout team near the bush. Naturally, we walked to the bush without any hesitation. To our horror, there was no one. Then we heard more noises from another bush that was a little bit deeper in the woods. Then we heard a clear conversation between a few people speaking French. We could hear them clearly, so we checked again, nothing. Then we saw another figure in white running fast in front of us, but his speed was weird. He was running so fast it looked like he was sliding across the forest. Keep in mind, we were in the woods at night with no lights. There's no way someone can run without making a noise, but somehow this figure was running silently and fast. It really seemed like he was just sliding. So again, we still didn't feel threatened though for some reason. We just had an adrenaline rush, excited to catch them, and happy to have the fun begin. For the next 2 or so hours, we kept hearing whistles and whispers in French, but we couldn't find a single person. It was so clear that there were a lot of people hiding around us, but we couldn't catch even one of them. They were fast and so sneaky. This is important to mention, but the arriving teams were not from France, so it was weird to hear them speaking in French. Throughout the entire night, we kept seeing these white figures sliding around all around us in the dark. We couldn't see any faces. They were fast and strange. We could hear loud laughter and French whispers all around our camp the whole night. The sun came up and the strange thing stopped. We didn't manage to catch anyone or figure out who they were. In the morning, to our shock, the other teams finally arrived. We had these leaderboard meetings every afternoon where we would discuss daily plans and meals. Also, we would share about any planned or failed attacks. All the team leaders said they arrived in the morning, so they were not even in the woods that night. Up to this day, I have no idea who those people were. I have no idea what they wanted or what their plans were. They never attacked or kidnapped anyone on the team. It was scary when I think of it. What would happen if we didn't have guards that night? What would happen if we were all asleep? At the end of the day, this was a campsite in the wilderness, a perfect place for cults and other crazies to gather.
For our next story, we're headed to New Mexico, where a couple camping in the Cerro Grande Mountains gets a late night visit from something huge.
Hi, my name is Joe and I'm 20 years old. I recently had an encounter that was definitely unexplainable. First, let me start out by telling you the story from the very beginning. I'm from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and the closest camp spots to me are in the Cerro Grande Mountains. I have a friend who visits them often to go hunting, fishing, and camping. A couple years ago, my buddy told me a story about an encounter he and his family had at a spot called The Meadow. He said that about an hour before sundown, they were at the camp spot and they all heard a loud shrieking sound a couple hundred feet away. He told me that the sound had lasted for about 30 seconds. He said he could see the sky and there was just enough light out to see in between the trees on the ridge. The meadow is in a small valley with two flat ridges on either side. As everyone was sitting around the campfire, he told me that he looked up at the ridge and saw something walking upright in between the trees. He said the being would walk back and forth in between trees until sundown. He didn't tell anyone at the time because his girlfriend and sisters were camping with him and he didn't want to cause a scare. After falling asleep, he was woken up in the middle of the night to another shrieking sound. Only this time, the shrieking sound was coming from up on one of the ridges. He said the sound was so loud that he could literally feel it and lasted about a minute and a half. This made me very interested and curious, so I asked for the location. About a month ago, I took my girlfriend to the campsite and we stayed a few nights and heard nothing. This past weekend was Labor Day, so I took my girlfriend once again to this campsite and had a very different experience altogether. The first night was a great night with nothing out of the ordinary. The second night was something else. My friend was camping a couple miles away, so we went and visited him. It was getting dark, so I told my girlfriend that we needed to get back to camp. I drove sort of hastily back to camp, and when we arrived, I started the fire immediately. After I started the fire, my girlfriend and I sat by it, and I felt extremely tense, and I didn't know why. This went on for about an hour until my girlfriend got irritated with me. I told her I just wanted to go to bed. I packed a lot of wood on the fire, and we crawled in the back of my Hummer, and we went to sleep. Before I go on, I want to give you a description of my campsite. I was parked facing away from the entrance of the site. There was a canopy directly behind the vehicle. Underneath the canopy was my backpack and the garbage bag. The campfire was about 15 feet away from the canopy with two chairs next to it. We are lying with our heads facing the back of the vehicle, and my girlfriend is to the left of me. We go to sleep, and sometime later, I wake up. I'm still super groggy, but looking up at the ceiling of the vehicle, I can see a slight glow of the fire, and then it goes out moments later. Immediately after the light goes out, I hear something rub up against the vehicle on my side. I hear it until I can hear it knock over a shovel and two fishing poles. My adrenaline starts going fast. I don't wake my girlfriend up because I didn't want to scare her. I listened to this thing for about 10 minutes. It was very dark at this point, and there was no moon out. After about 15 minutes, I hear the thing rub up against the vehicle again. At this point, I grab my girlfriend and I say, "I need you to listen to me carefully. There is something outside of the Hummer. I don't know what it is. I don't know how big it is, but something's out there and I'm gonna get the gun." She says okay, and I reach for my 9mm and turn it off safety. I lie there clenching my gun and her, and I listened to the thing raise hell outside. I hear what sounds like tearing apart of the trash bag and big footsteps and grunts. My girlfriend tells me to calm down because she can feel me trembling. Every time my girlfriend and I hear a noise, we clinch each other because we were hearing the same thing. We lie there, listening to the noises for what feels like about 20 minutes before I start to calm down. At this point, I had accepted the fact that there was a bear outside my vehicle and it was getting what it was after. The sounds are coming from next to the campfire. I hear the chairs fall over, and eventually the sounds come close to the vehicle again. A couple of times, I would post up on my arm to see if I could make out any kind of figure, but it is too dark to see anything. The only thing I can make out is the end of the tree line. The sky was just a little brighter than the trees. I could also see a small glowing of embers from the campfire, but not enough to light anything else up. I couldn't see anything, but the noises continued. I can remember saying to my girlfriend, "Our camp is going to be a mess in the morning." I was trying to calm my girlfriend down because she wanted to leave. Eventually, the noises started coming from her side of the vehicle. On that side was the ice chest and the dry box, both full of food. It is messing with them, and it sounded like it dumped the ice chest. The noises continued for probably about 5 minutes. At this point, I was sitting up on my heels looking out the window, but could still see nothing. The next thing I hear is it touching the vehicle, and a second later I hear a loud clang. It was the sound of the canopy breaking apart and hitting the ground. I was looking out the back window and could see the sky now. In my head, I can picture a bear climb up onto the bracing of the canopy and collapse it where it stood. My girlfriend says, "Did you see that thing?" Assuming that she was asking if I could see it, I said, "No, I can't see anything." She starts crying hysterically and says, "I'm not okay, I want to leave now." I say okay and clench my gun as I crawl into the driver's seat. I sit for a couple of seconds before I started the vehicle because I didn't know what would happen when I did. I then start the vehicle and turn right to make a U-turn and drive out of there. I see no kind of animal or living thing. I drive about 10 minutes until I hit the main road. I park there, and my girlfriend is still in the back crying. I crawl back there to console her. We then slept on the main road until sunrise. We both woke up around 7:30 a.m. and start talking about it, and it was then that she said, "I saw the thing." I said, "What?" She said, "Don't you remember me asking if you saw that thing?" I said, "Yeah," and she went on to tell what she saw. Keep in mind, she was lying down the entire time and refused to sit up. She said she was lying down, looking up at the sky, which was lighter than everything else. She was looking out the side window. She said as soon as the canopy hit the ground, she saw something black fly past the window. She said it was taller than the top of the window and headed back the direction it originally came from, which just so happened to be away from all the main roads. My Hummer is about 6 feet tall, and if she was lying down, looking up, and sees something taller than the top window, whatever it was had to have been over 8 feet tall. After our conversation, we agreed to go back up to the campsite to collect our things: the canopy, the chairs, the cooler, the dry box, the shovel, the fishing poles, my backpack, and make sure to clean up the garbage. I was chilled to the bone when we arrived back at the campsite. There was not one thing out of place. There were only 2 things visibly wrong with the campsite. The chairs were knocked over and the canopy was turned upside down about 20 feet from where it was standing. I want you to know there was no wind that night. Now, if a bear got to this canopy, it would have been collapsed and torn. But what this meant to me was that whatever knocked over my canopy had to have picked it up and thrown it 20 feet. I put on my shoes, which I had left there the night prior, and started scouring the area. The trash, which was open and not tied the night before, was not tampered with. My backpack was right where I left it. The cooler and the dry box were in the exact same spot, and we never really took an inventory of their contents the night prior, so we could not tell if there was anything missing. This scared the hell out of me, because it meant that whatever was there had the dexterity to rummage through everything and do whatever it did and leave it the way it was found. A bear would have torn the campsite apart looking for food, and we would have found our trash everywhere. After a few minutes of looking around, We packed up and left. I want whoever reads this to know that I don't drink and I have never touched drugs. What happened to me that night was not just the wind, but it was very real. I have never before in my life felt terror like that, and numerous times through writing you my story, I have broken out in tears because I hate to relive it.
Next up, a California woman is tormented throughout her childhood by a terrifying mimicking entity.
This has been something that's haunted me since I was 6 years old, since my first encounter with it. I have had dreams about this, and 2 very specific encounters with the creature. I'm sharing this story so I could possibly find help on what to do, or how to get rid of this creature that's been hunting me since I can remember. Just for background, I'm a 21-year-old female and still worry about this creature finding me, but I'll get into detail why later. For now, here's my story. I would always go camping with my grandparents, who I call my Gammy and Gampy, looking forward to it since I grew up loving the outdoors in the woods. I especially loved camping, loving the idea of having s'mores, taking long hikes, being around the campfire, and, of course, the wildlife we would see. I grew up in California, mostly near cities, so the forest was like my true home to me. I always preferred being near trees and dirt rather than buildings and crowded places. Besides, the woods were much quieter and more peaceful. I always felt safe when I was there, like nothing could ever hurt me. But something strange would always happen at the end of the month of May. I would have this reoccurring dream during the last week of my school year. I would be in the woods, walking alone down a dirt trail. The woods were always strangely quiet. I would continue to walk this path until I saw this red fox poke its head from behind a tree. Its eyes were always strangely human-like, but they were yellow and somehow looked like teddy bear eyes, and it would just stare at me. It wouldn't make a sound at all, it would just watch me. Usually in my dream, I would go up and pet it, causing the fox to finally make a noise, usually a soft growl. Then I would continue walking and it would follow me. The first time I would have this dream was when I was actually around 5 years old, and it lasted until I was about perhaps 11. Over the years, it would be the same exact thing. I would walk in the woods, find this fox, pet it, then continue my hike with it alongside me. But about having this dream for the 4th time, it would start to walk behind me. That's when I started to feel uneasy about this fox. I could hear it making odd noises, but every time I went back to look, it was just walking like nothing was wrong, even, somehow, giving me a smile. Sorry to go on about a dream, but I now believe that it was a warning of the creature. Now that the dream is out of the way, I can talk about my first true encounter. I was 6 years old and was going on a camping trip with my Gammy and Gampy for about a week. Of course, I was very excited for it, being able to barely keep myself in my school seat for the last day of kindergarten. They had picked me up right as the bell had rung and already had the camping trailer attached to my Gampy's truck. I remember he drove an old red truck that only had 3 seats, me always being in the middle. It took about 2 hours to get there and another good hour to find our usual camping spot. It was deep into the woods and far from other people, as my Gammy wasn't too fond of being around other people while we camped. As they were setting up the camping trailer, I wandered around the campsite, loving to dig in the dirt for bugs. I had sat down on the dirt and started to dig, but I noticed how strangely quiet the woods were. It was typically never quiet, not even in the dead of night. I thought it was odd, but being only 6, I didn't think too hard about it. As I continued to dig for bugs, however, I thought I heard my Gammy call for me. Sugar booger!
She would usually call me Sugar Booger, being a nickname she gave me when I was born. That's what I had heard, but it sounded like she was very far away and somewhat sick. I looked up where I heard it come from, but it looked like it was coming from the woods. There was no way she was there because she was still unloading stuff from the truck. Even at the age of 6, it didn't feel right, so I walked closer to my grandparents and stayed next to them. I soon forgot about my weird encounter, though, as we began to have fun. For the rest of that day, we played card games, sat next to the campfire as we ate dinner, and stared up into the stars. I always loved seeing the stars there. There were never any where I lived. We started to get ready for bed around 9 p.m. There were bunk beds that me and my Gammy would sleep on, keeping our luggage on the top bunk, and we would sleep on the bottom bunk. Due to my Gampy's snoring, he would sleep on the couch of the trailer. I would always sleep next to the trailer window just in case I couldn't sleep and wanted to look outside. I fell asleep pretty quickly, though, that being the last day of school and all, it was pretty exhausting.
I remember waking up maybe an hour later and it still was pitch black outside. It wasn't weird for me to wake up late in the night, since I always have had sleeping issues. I rolled onto my side trying to fall back asleep until I heard my nickname being spoken.
Sugar booger.
But I knew it wasn't either of my grandparents. They were both asleep and never known to sleep talk before. I started to feel this horrible feeling in my gut, like whatever I was hearing wanted to really hurt me. Even at the age of 6, I knew this wasn't normal. Then I started to hear tapping at the trailer window. It was soft, but loud enough for me to hear it. I just sat there, frozen in fear. I was trying to just brush it off as tree branches or rain, but I just knew that wasn't it. I could tell that it was really someone or something tapping on the window. Then I decided to be brave and look. Big mistake. I pulled the curtain away to only peek, and all I saw were these large yellow eyes. They seemed glassy, yet not entirely real. They looked like giant teddy bear eyes, but cold and unwelcoming. I remember in that moment I panicked and quickly closed the curtain back up. I then quickly hid under the blanket, being the only thing I knew to do when I saw a monster. I could feel tears falling down my face. I had never been so terrified in my life. I just curled up into my gammy's side and clung to her all night long, that damn tapping only getting louder and more persistent throughout the night. I don't remember falling asleep, but somehow I did. I do remember my Gampy waking me up around noon, saying if I got up quick enough, we could still go fishing. I honestly didn't want to leave the trailer at all, terrified that whatever I saw the night before would still be out there. I did eventually go outside, but I was constantly looking around, horrified that whatever I saw last night would get me. When I got up, my Gammy immediately knew I was scared and pulled me into a hug when she saw me, asking what was wrong. I told her what I saw and heard, and surprisingly, she believed me. The next thing I knew, she was telling my Gampy that we were moving campsites. It took a bit to convince, but he did eventually started to pack up and hook the trailer onto his truck. I was put into the truck so I could lay down and rest, but I just couldn't stop feeling like I was being watched, thinking that every little noise was that thing I saw, that if I closed my eyes, even for a second, it would get me. My Gammy wasn't too far from me when I heard it again. This time it was my actual name.
Bethany.
In that moment, I had never seen my Gammy move so fast.
Bethany, come here.
She looked up into the bushes where we heard it, then to me. She then got in the truck with me and pulled me into a tight, protective hug.
Bethany.
I began to cry all over again, telling her how I wanted to just go back home. That's when my Gampy got into the truck as well, and since I was sobbing so hard to the point I was coughing, he decided it was a good idea to go home too. We started to head out of the campsite, still disappointed that this trip had been ruined by something. But I still didn't know what. That's when something in my head told me to look back. I slowly did so, feeling an ice-cold fear wash over me as I saw something. It was a red fox sitting in the middle of the campsite, sitting there with large yellow eyes. The same red fox from my dream somehow, curling its lips into an eerie smile. After that encounter, we never went back to that campsite. We did continue to camp, but in more populated areas. I didn't tell my grandma what I saw, but she had told me to trust my gut. She knew that I was sensitive to certain entities, and that would help me if I trusted it. Now this would be the end of the story, but I'm afraid it isn't. There was one more encounter I had with the creature, and it was much more terrifying than the first time. The second encounter I had was when I was 17, many years later. By this time, I knew very well what a skinwalker was, and I was still very paranoid every time I went near wooded areas. I still worried about seeing the fox, but I didn't think about it too much. Me and my 2 younger siblings were staying at a relative's house for Christmas way up into the mountains. I think they were my great aunt and uncle, but I'm not sure. Where they lived, there was no service at all, so unless we hooked up onto their Wi-Fi, we had no phones. At night, I hated how they didn't close the window curtains, making it easy for anything outside to see inside. But I did feel safe while inside the house, knowing that they wouldn't let anything hurt us. Luckily, it didn't snow where they lived, so we could go outside and run around. They also had this beautiful black lab, about a year old, named Pam. She was very playful and normally wouldn't listen to anyone but my uncle. Although she was easily excitable, she was a very good puppy. One of the days we were there, my little sister and our aunt went out to the store for a girls' day. Although I too am a girl, I wanted to go hiking with my uncle and my little brother. It was a really chilly morning, but since we were doing so much hiking, it felt great. We also decided to take Pam so she could get some exercise and have fun. About maybe an hour into our hike, I started to slow down a bit, wanting to enjoy the beautiful forest. It was so peaceful, I could have honestly stayed there forever. But as we continued to walk, I started to feel something odd. I noticed how quiet the forest had suddenly become, hearing only our footsteps and my brother talking to our uncle. Pam noticed it too. Her ears went straight up and she started growling softly. I started to pick up my pace to get next to my brother, worried that possibly a coyote or mountain lion was nearby. My little brother was only 9 at that time, and being the oldest sibling, my natural instincts to protect him started to kick in. After a bit, my uncle noticed the silence as well, telling us to stay close to him and Pam, who was now next to me and started to growl. I began to feel that horrible feeling again, that ice-cold fear I once felt when I was 6. I tried so hard to not think of the creature, but it was all I could think about. I felt like I was back to being that scared little 6-year-old girl again. I had to stop for a moment, though, seeing that my shoelace had come undone. I quickly kneeled down to tie it back up, trying to hurry and get out of there. That's when I heard it. In that moment, my heart dropped into my stomach. My eyes were widened, and I could just feel myself start to shake from fear. It was right next to me. I heard it clear as day. I slowly turned my head, and there it was. That same red fox, still having those horrid yellow eyes and that same demented smile. Only this time I saw it much more clearly. Its fur looked so matted and disgusting, the smell it had was like rotten, decaying flesh mixed with garbage. Its limbs were much too long for a normal fox, the back legs bending completely the wrong way. Those eyes were still the worst thing about it. But now they looked emptier than I had remembered. I wanted to scream, to run, to cry, but I just couldn't. I was frozen and too scared to even blink. Then I heard it speak again. This time, however, it had mimicked my little brother's voice.
Bethany, come here.
Before anything else could happen, Pam suddenly jumped in front of me and started to bark like mad, snapping and growling so aggressively that it scared me out of my frozen trance. When I looked back, it was gone. I used that moment to run over to my brother and uncle, who didn't see what I saw as they were too far ahead now. But I heard my uncle start to pray and sing a song under his breath, keeping my brother and myself close to him. I was too scared to look back, so I kept my eyes on the ground and refused to stop walking. Pam had stopped barking, but she was still loudly growling, looking back behind us every few steps and never left my side as we continued our hike. My little brother was a bit worried, but he just thought it was a coyote. When we finally made it into town, my uncle called our aunt and told her to pick us up, saying something about how it wasn't safe for us to walk back. Thankfully, she did come and get us, but she was confused since we talked about that hike for days. On the car ride back, Pam never left my side. She was right there with me the entire time. She knew that thing was after me and she protected me from it. Who knows what would have happened if she wasn't there. When we got back to the house, I told my uncle and aunt. Once I told them what happened and what I saw, they started to go all around the house and check that all the locks were shut tight. Unfortunately, this cut our Christmas vacation short, because they felt I wasn't safe up there in the woods. We had to be taken home the next day with an excuse of how there was an emergency with a friend and that they had to help them out. I felt horrible that this Christmas was ruined, but once I left the woods, I truly felt safe again. Before they had to drive back home, though, they told me that it wasn't my fault and that luckily it didn't hurt me or the other kids. It did make me feel a bit better, but it still brought up a lot of questions and worries. Was it still around? What did it want with me? Was I just going to be tormented by this thing forever? I still don't have answers to these questions, and that's what really scares me. Now, I've long moved from California and now live in Kentucky. I do live in woods, but so far it hasn't found me, and I hope it never does.
Bethany, come here.
Next, we're headed to the Midwest, where a boy, while camping with his parents in the Garden of the Gods, Illinois, befriends a shadow figure.
It was the summer of 1984, and we decided to take our newly acquired, but used, Nimrod camper out for its first adventure. If you're unfamiliar, it's pretty much a pop-up tent that folds flat into a little trailer so that you can tow it behind your car. Our destination was the southern tip of Illinois. To be more exact, the area called the Garden of the Gods. It's a spectacular place and very rustic, as in there are no hookups for water or power. They did have restrooms of sorts, scattered about the various camping locations. They were a small cement building whose interior reminded me of an outhouse. I learned later these are called vault toilets. I've heard that in some areas they have cabins you can rent, but the forest is so huge we neither saw them or even evidence of other people when we pulled into the area we had been assigned to, almost at the rim of a very deep valley. My son, Josh, was only 2 at the time and insisted he wanted to help Daddy set up the camper, while I gathered firewood and set up the rest of our site. I wasn't gone long. Firewood in a forest is easy to find, and my husband was still setting up the camper. Well, actually, fidgeting with getting the door in right. "Where's Josh?" I immediately asked, not seeing him in plain sight. My then husband, half turning while pointing, froze looking at empty space. We both started calling his name and searching the area. He was gone, nowhere to be seen, and I strained my ears for any muffled cry or anything. I studied the ground for hints of his trail, clues to which direction he may have wandered off in. My now ex thought I was crazy, kneeling down in the spot he'd last seen my boy and slowly turning in a circle. I was making myself Josh-sized and trying to see things as he had. Straining my eyes for bent grass, a partial print, anything to say "this way." Inwardly, I was both praying and summoning up every scrap of knowledge I had ever learned about tracking, while in my head I heard the words of the old man at the registration cabin saying, "Watch out for bears and coyotes. There's some snakes too." I felt his dad's hand on my shoulder and I hissed, "You go back to the registration area. You go back and tell them our boy's lost. They'll get us help. I'll keep looking." He opened his mouth to protest, I think, then turned to get in the pickup truck. He knew, city boy that he was, this was more my world than his, and I stood a better chance. Still kneeling, I forced myself to breathe deep, to find that inner core of strength and open myself. I found myself getting up and wandering to the opposite side of the camper and staring down into the valley, where large boulders jutted up out of the ground and trunks of trees towered up. Below me, eagles circled and soared. The glory of this beauty nearly lost me as I scanned for a small figure. From my peripheral vision on my left, I saw something move on the ridge. I spun in that direction and saw nothing for a moment. I dropped to my knee. "Look, there," I said. In the distance in the shadows of the trees, a dark child-sized shadow ran. "Josh!" I called. It paused looking at me, I think, then ran behind a larger tree, lost from view. I was up in a flash running towards where I had seen him. Logically, I knew though toddlers can move like greased lightning, but this was not my boy I was chasing down. This dark shadow was always ahead of me, just far enough I'd see him but not details, but it obviously wanted to be seen, and followed. I heard a man's voice.
"Leave a trail. Won't do any good to get lost yourself."
I responded by purposely breaking twigs and snapping long-stemmed flowers as I passed. A blind tracker could follow me. I talked to the air. "Help me find my boy!" Tears were threatening to flow, but now was not the time. Again, just ahead and to the right, I saw the shadow boy, and again, I was running. The voice would yell,
"Leave a trail marker here."
and I'd snap something on the fly. I was not quietly stalking. Heck, I was no longer even tracking. I forced myself to stop panic searching. I forced myself to stop, right where I was, and become still. Not just outer still, but inwardly. Panicking like this was not the answer. Blindly chasing shadows was not the answer. This was not the way to find my boy. I closed my eyes and focused. Imagery slowly emerged from behind my closed eyes. I saw a kind of tunnel with my child inside. I frowned. That made no sense. Something whacked me in the shoulder, not hard but enough to make me jerk my head, with my eyes flying open in that direction. Perhaps 2 yards away, closer than ever before, was that dark child. A bit more than shadow, but still very vague, as in I couldn't make out details such as clothing or facial features. Older than 2, but quite young. This time, instead of darting off, he waved me to come. I snapped another twig and followed because I felt I should. He stayed just a bit ahead, and from time to time his form would twist, as if looking back to be sure I followed. I lost him somewhere, or perhaps he just vanished. I sat down on a large fallen log and looked back the way I'd came. "Where are you?" My voice a coarse whisper from all the calling I'd been doing. To the forest spirits I cried, "What the hell was the point of this? I don't understand." My voice broke, and lowering my head I began to cry, out of fear for my boy and frustration. I felt a small hand on my thigh. Turning my head, I saw my son, miraculously standing there. I snatched him into my arms before he could evaporate, for I was sorely afraid he was just a trick of my mind, but he was real. He was my boy. How I laughed to hear him say, "You squishing me." "Where have you been? I've looked everywhere for you." "There," he pointed at the log. I was baffled. "I didn't see you." He giggled. "Inside." My friend woke me up. "He says you here." "Inside where? Can you show me?" He gives me that look that only small children give well. It asks if you're an idiot because to them it's so obvious. Taking me by the hand, he led me to the end of the log I'd been sitting on and pointed. Squatting down, I see it's hollow inside and I recall my vision of a tunnel. "I playing with my friend and got tired. He said safe there." I nod. "Yes, safer there than in the open." In my head, I added, "Where bears or coyotes could get you easier." Out loud, I say, "We should get back to Daddy. He's looking for you too." We followed my blind man's trail back with my son telling me his adventure. From what I gathered, he'd gotten bored helping Daddy because he wasn't allowed to do anything, and he got tired of digging in the dirt. So he started looking around. When he was on the other side of the camper looking down at the birds and stuff, this boy came up and told him it wasn't safe to play there and led him over to the trees. The boy's name was Chaska. After a while, Josh became very tired, and he and his friend curled up in the log for a nap. Then all of a sudden, I was there. Of course, no one else believed his story. They thought it was all imagination, with the exception of the old man for the reception area. He looked at me the way a sage would and said, "Chaska is Sioux for firstborn son."
Coming up, two first-time campers have an experience that makes them never want to go camping again.
My girlfriend and I went camping 5 hours away from home for her birthday and our anniversary. We made the trip the day after a big storm passed through. We left town early and got there in the early afternoon. The guy at the entrance to the campgrounds mentioned there was no one else staying there that weekend. First, we drove down a long pathway to our designated area. As you got closer to it, the road narrowed. So basically, you had to back out to get out. We unloaded the car, got the tent set up, and decided to go walk around the woods. It was dead silent. But it was still bright out, so we just took in all the nature we could and walked a few miles away. We reached this point in the woods where there were some weird-looking white cabins. They were very uniform, all built the exact same way, like, I guess they were a part of the camping grounds, but they seemed way out of the way, and there was no sign of life. It felt eerie, and we felt like we shouldn't be there, so we turned around and walked back. We took a breather in the tent, then tried to start a fire in the fire pit. Unfortunately, neither of us had ever been camping before and had no idea how to start a fire. We had bought some of those self-lighting logs from Walmart and some lighter fluid, but everything else around us was soaked to the bone from the rain that had passed through the day before. We knew we needed kindling of some sort, but any dry sticks or leaves were far and few between. Eventually, we got a small fire going and ate hot dogs and marshmallows and spent some time looking at the stars. Then, we noticed just how dark it was out there. My girlfriend was easily spooked and asked, "Can we get into the tent now?" So we put the fire out and crawled into the tent. We were talking to each other, but I could tell she was tense. Suddenly, she put her hand over my mouth and said, "Shh, do you hear that?" Before I could respond, we heard footsteps, heavy footsteps. It sounded like a group of people walking. I whispered to her, "It's probably just animals or something." Then we heard mumbling, like low mumbling. We couldn't make out words, but it didn't sound like a sound an animal could make. It sounded like words, but hushed and just mumbling. We sat in silence, staring at each other in the dark for what felt like forever. The mumbling got louder, as did the footsteps, until it sounded like it was right outside of our tent. We both froze. I don't think either of us were breathing. And then, silence. We waited and waited and waited. I'm still not sure how much time passed. Eventually, my girlfriend said, "We have to get to your car." The adrenaline was pumping, so I peeked out of the tent into the darkness and told her to stay behind me. Then we ran to the car. I locked the doors and she was like, "What the fuck was that? We can't stay here. No one is out here but us. What was that?" I kept looking around for any signs of life, but we were seemingly alone. I looked at her and was like, "I'm gonna grab our stuff. You stay in the car." We only had our ice chest and our tent out. I jumped out and ran, grabbed our ice chest, tossed it into the back seat. As I turned around to go get the tent, I started hearing footsteps closing in again. In a moment of pure terror, I yanked the tent out of the ground, wrapped the tarp around it, and slung it over my shoulder like some panicked Santa Claus and shoved it into the trunk. I didn't say anything when I got in the car except, "Do we have everything in here?" My girlfriend said yes, and I floored it in reverse out of our camping area. Then, we came to a fork in the road that went in like 6 different directions. I asked my girlfriend if she remembered which path we came down to get in here, and she told me she didn't know. We chose a random one and ended up in a different camping spot. I cursed under my breath and slammed it into reverse again. Then I noticed from the angle we had exited from, I could see the main path back to the gate thanks to a small sign behind an overgrown bush. As we hightailed it out of there, I noticed there was a single, small green light out in the woods to our right, near where our designated spot was. We drove the entire 5 hours back to our hometown and fell asleep on my girlfriend's parents' couch at around 4 a.m. We never talked about the trip ever again, and I haven't had any desire to camp since.
For our final story of the evening, we're headed to Newfoundland, where a pair of campers on a hike seemed to lose a couple of hours of time after seeing a mysterious figure standing by the water.
This is a real experience that happened to me when I was around 10, camping with my family at a provincial park in Canada in the 80s. There is a lot of traditional folklore about fairies, and being sort of mesmerized and stolen away by them. And although I've never really believed in that stuff, whenever I hear those tales, I can't help but think about this experience. We arrived at the campground around mid-afternoon. I remember that it was strangely empty and we saw no other occupied sites as we drove around looking for the perfect spot. We picked our site, and as my parents were setting up, my older sister asked if she and I could go check out the little beach area, which was a shortish walk along a clearly marked downhill path through some birch woods. Our mom said yes, but told us to be back in 2 hours. We found the sign pointing us to the beach trail and headed down the path. Almost as soon as we were out of sight of the campground, things started to feel off. It was weirdly quiet, with a sort of muffled feeling. No birds calling, no breeze, just a thick, velvety silence. I also noticed that there were strange-looking ferns growing thickly along the path all around us. Ferns are not an unusual sight in the Newfoundland woods, but these were different from the ones I'd seen before. Bright green and very, very large, and some were even as tall as I was. I couldn't shake the feeling that there were people or animals hiding in them, watching us pass by. Although it had been a lovely, clear day, the weather started to change as we walked. A low-lying fog rolled in as we descended, first in tendrils close to the ground, then gradually rising around us as we went lower toward the water. Even living in Newfoundland, I'd never walked into a fog like that before, and it did nothing to relieve the eerie feeling that I was trying to ignore. Finally, we arrived at a steep set of wooden stairs, and following them, we emerged onto a small, foggy beach. With the woods behind and above us, it felt very closed in, and I started wishing that we were safely back with our parents at our campsite. My sister made a small noise beside me, and I turned to see what had caught her attention. Although I'd thought we were alone, I now noticed that there was a man, several meters away, standing very still and gazing silently out over the water. My sister called out a friendly, "Hello." It was the 80s and people did that sort of thing, but he didn't move or appear to hear her. After a minute or two, I started to feel nervous, so I talked my sister into heading back to our campsite. This is where things get a bit fuzzy. I don't remember leaving the beach, but the next thing I knew, we were on a wide, unfamiliar dirt road. It seemed like no time had passed. but I was tired and my legs and feet felt like I'd been walking for a long time. The sun was also pretty low in the sky, which was strange because I thought we'd been gone for less than an hour. I felt disoriented and had no idea where we were, and I started to panic a bit, thinking we were lost. My sister immediately went into protective older sibling mode, saying not to worry because she was pretty sure she knew the way back. We headed off down the road in the direction she suggested, and walked for about 45 minutes or so until we finally emerged at the campground, not far from our campsite. It was now almost completely dark, and we ran to our trailer to find our dad there worriedly asking where we had been. Although we thought we'd been gone for less than 2 hours, my dad said we'd been gone for more than 5. He said that our mom had headed to the beach to look for us while he'd stayed to wait for us at the campsite. By now, full-on darkness was setting in, and our dad was worried that our mom had not returned with us. As he prepared to go out looking for her, she burst in the door, frantically saying that she'd run up and down the trail multiple times and still hadn't found us. She was amazed when she saw us. The only way to access that beach, aside from cutting through steep, thick woods, was to take that trail, and we had not passed her. Once we'd all calmed down, we ate dinner and headed to bed. As I lay in my bunk, I remember hearing my mom quietly tell my dad how creepy and strange the trail had felt. Although we'd planned to stay longer, we packed up and left quickly the following morning, and never returned to that campground again.
That's all for tonight, dear listeners. Hope these stories didn't cause you to change your mind about camping. If anything, I hope it encourages you to get out there and have your own experiences to write in about. Until next time, I'll be leaving you in the dark where whispers linger and shadows dance. Stay wary, sleep well, and beware the whispers in the night. If you have a story to tell, please reach out via email at contact@campfirecultpod.com or leave me a voicemail message at 720-297-8608. You can follow us anywhere on social media at Campfire Cult Pod and online at campfirecultpod.com. And finally, if you don't mind, please rate and review wherever possible.